They say the age of witch trials in America ended in Salem. But over a century later, in a dark hollow of the Tennessee mountains, one final ember of that medieval fear refused to die. The name whispered on the frontier was Mary Payton. She wasn't burned at the stake or hanged from a gallows, but what happened to her marks one of the last times an American court would formally hear an accusation of witchcraft. Who was this woman? And what could she have done to make her neighbors, people of the Bible and the long rifle, believe she could sour their milk, sicken their children, and consort with the devil himself? Tonight, we trace the story of a forgotten name to understand how a community's fear can be a more terrible sentence than any judge's verdict. To understand Mary Payton, you have to understand the soil she grew from. She was born into a world perched on the knife's edge between raw survival and unshakable faith. Her people were likely Scotch-Irish, a famously stubborn and clannish folk who had fled persecution in the old world only to find a different kind of hardship in the new. They brought with them their Presbyterian God, their distrust of authority, and a mind filled with tales of bogles, fetches, and the good folk, beings that Christianity had never fully managed to stamp out. Mary grew up in a log cabin chinked with mud and moss, where the hearth was the center of the universe and the dark woods outside were an endless, living mystery. Life was a brutal teacher. She would have seen siblings taken by fevers before they could walk, watched her parents' faces etched with worry over a failed crop, and learned from infancy that a single bad winter or a sick milk cow could mean the difference between life and death. The world was governed by forces you couldn't see, whether it was the hand of God or something far more ancient and sinister. From a young age, it was clear Mary walked a slightly different path. While other girls were learning the loom, Mary was learning the woods. Her mother, or perhaps a grandmother, was a granny woman, a keeper of the old knowledge. She taught Mary which roots could break a fever, which leaves could soothe a burn, and which mushrooms could kill a man. Mary had a gift for it. She had a quiet way with animals and a knack for finding the rarest herbs, as if the land itself spoke to her. There was a story, told long after, about a time when a neighbor's prized hunting dog was bitten by a copperhead. The dog's leg swelled to twice its size, its breathing grew shallow, and the man had all but given it up for dead. Mary, then just a girl, appeared at the edge of his property with a poultice of crushed plantain and mud. Without a word, she applied it to the wound. The next morning the swelling was down, and within a week the dog was chasing rabbits again. The man was grateful, but he was also unnerved. It just wasn't natural, the way she knew. This event forged the code Mary would live by. She learned that her knowledge was a double-edged sword. It could heal, but it could also create fear. Her code was one of fierce self-reliance and guarded silence. She came to trust the certainty of the seasons more than the fickle nature of people. She understood that in these mountains, a woman who knew too much, who lived too much on her own terms, was a person who invited whispers. And so, she was shaped not just by the hardships of the frontier, but by its deep-seated paranoia. She was a true daughter of Appalachia, resourceful, tough, and intimately connected to the land. But that very connection, the source of her strength and her identity, was the same thing that would one day be used to brand her as an outcast, a vessel for the very evil her neighbors feared was lurking just beyond the firelight. But before the whispers turned to accusations, Mary Payton had a life. For years, she was a quiet, respected fixture in her small corner of the mountains. In a place with no doctors for 100 miles, Mary was the one you went to when a child's cough turned into a death rattle in the middle of the night, or when a woodsman's axe wound wouldn't stop bleeding. She was, for all intents and purposes, the community's healer, a necessary shadow at the edge of their society. Imagine a young husband, wild-eyed with panic, pounding on her door in the dead of winter. His wife's first child is coming, but it's turned sideways and the labor has gone on for 2 days. The air in their cabin is thick with fear and the scent of blood. Mary would arrive with her leather satchel of dried herbs and roots, a figure of calm in the storm. She wouldn't speak of God or the devil. She'd speak of raspberry leaf tea to ease the pain and the right pressure to apply to the mother's back. Hours later, through her skill alone, the cabin would be filled not with the sounds of mourning, but with the cry of a newborn. Her payment wasn't in coin, but in kind. A sack of meal, a cured ham, a length of homespun cloth, tokens of a desperate gratitude. She asked for little and kept to herself, tending the garden behind her small, well-kept cabin. The place was a world of its own, every inch filled with purpose. Bundles of yarrow, goldenrod, and ginseng hung drying from the rafters, their earthy scent mingling with the constant aroma of wood smoke. Glass jars filled with salves and tinctures lined the shelves. This was the world she had built, a life of quiet competence and solitude after her husband had passed years before. This life, however, was built on a foundation of trust as thin as a winter's first ice. The very people who sought her help in the darkness of the night would sometimes look away when they passed her on the path in the bright light of day. They needed her knowledge, but they did not understand it. It was a power that came not from the preacher's Bible, but from the earth itself, and this made them uneasy. Mary Payton lived in that fragile space between reverence and fear, a respected healer who was only one failed crop, one sick child, one unexplained misfortune away from being something else entirely. Mary Payton's greatest strength was also the seed of her undoing. It wasn't pride in the way a rich man feels it, but an unbending, almost defiant self-possession. She trusted the evidence of her own eyes and hands far more than she trusted the pronouncements of preachers or the gossip of her neighbors. In a society held together by conformity and shared belief, Mary's refusal to bend her own knowledge to fit the fears of others was a quiet but constant act of rebellion. She had no patience for foolishness, and she would not pretend otherwise. This flaw was laid bare on a crisp autumn Sunday. A new circuit preacher had arrived in the settlement, a young man with more fire in his sermons than wisdom in his eyes. He spoke of the devil as if he saw him behind every tree, and his God was a God of wrath and judgment. After the service, a man approached the preacher, asking for prayers for his wife, who was wasting away from a lung sickness that left her pale and breathless. The preacher placed a hand on the man's shoulder and declared loudly, for all to hear, that this was a test of faith, and that only fervent prayer could cast out the demon of illness. Just then, Mary Payton, who had been trading herbs nearby, was asked by another woman if she had a remedy. Mary's gaze was clinical and sad. She knew this sickness. It was consumption, a slow, merciless drowning from within. She looked from the desperate husband to the proud preacher and spoke in a voice that was not loud, but cut through the air like a cold knife. "Prayer may comfort the spirit," she said, her words measured and clear, "but it will not clear the rot from her lungs. God put the healing roots in the earth for us to use. To let a woman die while ignoring his gifts is the true sin." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The preacher's face flushed with a furious red. In one sentence, Mary had not only dismissed his authority, but had framed his piety as a form of willful, deadly ignorance. She hadn't just offered a different opinion, she had challenged the very foundation of his power in front of the entire community. He saw her not as a healer, but as a rival, a purveyor of an older, darker knowledge that stood in direct opposition to his word. That day, Mary didn't just make an enemy of a powerful man, she showed everyone the crack in her armor. She had demonstrated that she stood apart, governed by her own code, her own wisdom. She would not bow, she would not flatter, and she would not pretend to believe what she knew to be untrue, even for the sake of peace. That stubborn, unwavering honesty in a world fueled by fear was the most dangerous flaw of all. The spark landed in the Miller cabin. Their youngest boy, a child who had been healthy and strong just a month before, was seized by a wasting sickness. A fever burned like a coal behind his eyes, and he grew thinner each day until his skin was like parchment stretched over bone. Desperate, the Millers did as the circuit preacher commanded. They prayed, they fasted, they looked for sin in their own hearts. But the boy only worsened. Then other things began to happen. Their best milk cow went dry overnight. A batch of bread made from their dwindling flour soured in the oven. Driven half-mad by grief and the preacher's fiery whispers, Thomas Miller finally broke. He didn't come to Mary's cabin asking for a cure. He came looking for a culprit. He found her by the creek bed, gathering river stones, her back to the path. He wasn't alone. His wife stood a few paces behind him, weeping into her apron, and several other neighbors had followed, drawn by the grim set of his jaw. The air grew thick and still. "Mary," he said, his voice a ragged tear in the quiet afternoon. "My boy is dying." Mary turned, her hands full of smooth grey stones. She saw the pain in his eyes, but she also saw the fear and something uglier beneath it. "I am sorry to hear it, Thomas," she replied, her voice even. "Fevers in the young are a terrible thing." This was the moment. This was the affront. Miller didn't hear sympathy. He heard a cold, distant pronouncement. His desperation, stoked by the preacher's paranoia, curdled into accusation. "You can fix it," he choked out, taking a step closer. "You brought back the Jennings dog from a snake bite. You set my own brother's leg when it was shattered. You can stop this. Lift your hex, Mary. In God's name, lift it." The plea was an accusation, a public branding. He was asking her to confess to being the source of his misery. And here, Mary Payton's unbending nature sealed her fate. She did not try to soothe him. She did not offer a poultice or a comforting word. She saw his fear as an insult to her life's work, a victory for the ignorance she so despised. Her expression hardened. "Your son is sick, Thomas," she stated, her words as cold and hard as the stones in her hand. "He is not cursed, and your fear is a worse sickness than any fever." To the grieving father, her refusal to engage with his terror was not a denial, it was a confirmation. It was the chilling indifference of the guilty. The last thread of his reason snapped. He pointed a trembling finger at her, and his voice rose to a shout that echoed through the holler for all to hear. "Witch! You are a witch!" The word, once spoken, could never be taken back. It hung in the air, a poison that had finally found its victim. The word witch, once spoken aloud, is a poison seed. It landed on the fertile ground of the community's fear and put down immediate thorny roots. The whispers that had once been confined to the shadows now flew in the open air. Doors that had once opened to Mary with pleas for help now slammed shut as she approached. Mothers who had once thanked her for saving their children now pulled them away from the path when she walked by, shielding their eyes as if from a terrible glare. Mary was no longer just a woman who knew things. She was the thing itself, the source of all their bad luck, the face of their deepest anxieties. Jedediah Stone, an old hunter whose own life Mary had saved years ago after a run-in with a wounded bear, was one of the few who dared to speak to her. He found her at dusk, splitting firewood with a grim, rhythmic determination, as if the accusation had changed nothing. "Mary," he began, his voice low and rough. "You're a sensible woman. Too sensible for your own good, maybe. But you need to put an end to this. Go to the Millers. Take them a sassafras tea. Tell them you're praying for the boy. You don't have to mean it. Just say the words. Give their fear something to chew on besides you." Mary stopped, the axe held motionless in her hand. She looked at Jedediah, and he saw not fear in her eyes, but a cold, burning disappointment. "And what would that be, Jedediah, but a lie?" she asked. "Their boy is sick with a wasting fever, not a hex. Their fear is the sickness that's spreading. To give them a charm would be to admit that their foolishness has power. I will not feed the beast that is devouring them." Jedediah shook his head, a deep sadness in his weathered face. "That beast is about to devour you, Mary," he said, before turning and walking away, leaving her alone in the growing twilight. Her refusal left a vacuum, and the circuit preacher was more than willing to fill it. The following Sunday, he stood at his makeshift pulpit and delivered a sermon of fire and brimstone. He never spoke Mary Payton's name, but he didn't have to. He spoke of a serpent in their midst, a canker of old-world evil that masqueraded as a helping hand. He warned of those who put their faith in roots and leaves instead of the power of the Lord, who used earthly knowledge as a mockery of God's divine will. He was giving the community's fear a holy purpose, turning a personal grudge into a righteous crusade. Any other person might have retreated, stayed inside their cabin, and waited for the storm to pass. But that was not Mary's way. Her defiance became her only response. She continued to walk the paths, her head held high, her gaze direct. She met the fearful stares of her neighbors, not with anger, but with a silent, questioning look that they took for a malediction. She was daring them to believe the lie, and in their terror, they accepted the dare. Each decision she made, born from her unshakable integrity, was another nail in her own coffin. A dead bird, its neck snapped, appeared on her doorstep. Someone etched a crude cross on her cabin door to ward off its inhabitant. The path of compromise, the one Jedediah had offered, was now completely gone. Mary had refused to bow, and so she had forced the community to act. A confrontation was no longer just possible, it was a certainty. They needed a judgment, a final verdict to quell the terror she, in her stubborn silence, seemed to confirm. The law, in those days, often had a human face. It arrived not in a uniform, but in the worn, homespun coat of Justice of the Peace Thompson, a pragmatic man who had seen more trouble stirred by religion than by rum. He didn't believe in witches, but he absolutely believed in mobs. He came to Mary's cabin not as a judge, but as a man trying to put out a fire before it consumed the whole forest. He found her inside, methodically grinding dried willow bark, the air thick with its sharp medicinal scent. He sat at her small, rough-hewn table, a place of healing now at the center of a storm of hate. "Mary," he said, getting straight to the point, his voice lacking the preacher's fire or miller's hysteria. "I've known you for 20 years. You've mended more bones and cured more fevers than any woman in this county. But reason has left these people. They're scared, and the preacher is fanning the flames. Thomas Miller has made a formal accusation. I have to hold a hearing." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "But it doesn't have to come to that. There's a wagon train heading west in 2 weeks. I can buy this plot from you myself for a fair price. You could be in Kentucky by summer. Start over where nobody knows this story. This is not an order, Mary. It is an offer, a way out, a road to peace." It was the last, most sensible off-ramp. An exile, yes, but a safe one. A chance to live, to continue her work somewhere the soil wasn't so poisoned with fear. For a long moment, Mary was silent. Her gaze drifted around the small cabin. She saw the bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, each one a memory of a day spent in the sun-dappled woods. She saw the shelves of tinctures, each one a story of a life she had touched. This cabin, this small plot of land, this was not just a place. It was the physical record of her entire existence. To leave it would be to erase herself. To flee would be to sign a confession in the dust of the road behind her. She finally met the justice's gaze, and her eyes, though weary, held no hint of surrender. "And what name would I use in Kentucky, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, her voice quiet but unshakable. "Whatever name I chose, the one they gave me here would follow. I would arrive not as a healer, but as a woman who ran from a charge of witchcraft. Their lie would become my truth." She stood up, her hands stained with the dust of the willow bark. "I have done no wrong. This is my home. I will not be driven from it by the fears of ignorant men. Let them have their hearing." In that moment, she made her choice. She chose her name over her life, her integrity over her safety. She turned away from the last road to peace and set her feet firmly on the path that led directly to her reckoning. The hearing was held not in a courthouse, but in the settlement's largest cabin, which also served as its church. The space was packed shoulder to shoulder, the air hot and suffocating, thick with the smell of unwashed wool, nervous sweat, and the cloying righteousness of the mob. To Mary, sitting alone on a simple stool in the center of the room, it felt less like a place of judgment and more like a cage built of hostile eyes. Justice Thompson sat at a rough-hewn table, his face a mask of grim resignation. But the real judge and jury were the dozens of familiar faces that now stared at her as if she were a complete stranger, a monster that had been living among them undetected. The world seemed to narrow, the buzzing whispers fading into a dull roar in her ears as Thomas Miller stood to speak. He did not shout. His voice was a low, trembling thing, filled with a grief so profound it had become poison. He described his son's wasting sickness, his words painting a vivid, heartbreaking picture. Then he turned, his face a contorted mask of pain and certainty, and pointed a trembling finger at Mary. He spoke of how the boy had screamed her name in his fever dreams. He spoke of the sour milk and the dead dog. Each word was a stone cast not to prove a fact, but to inflict a wound. And with every sentence, Mary could feel the weight of the room's belief settling upon her like a shroud. Then came the others. A woman stood and swore that her butter had refused to churn the morning after Mary had walked past her cow pen. A farmer claimed a shadow in the shape of a great black bird had passed over his field, and the next day a patch of his corn was blighted. One by one, they offered up their misfortunes, their anxieties, their petty bad luck, and laid them at her feet. It was a litany of fear, a ritual of communal exorcism where every coincidence was proof and every suspicion was evidence. Mary listened, and the world outside the cabin walls, the world of cause and effect, of seasons and sickness, seemed to fall away, replaced by this suffocating new reality built entirely of their terror. The circuit preacher rose, his shadow falling long across the room. He did not need to present evidence. His role was to provide the divine narrative. He wove their disparate tales of woe into a single terrifying tapestry of satanic influence. He spoke of the serpent in the garden, the wolf in sheep's clothing. He looked directly at Mary, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire, and declared that God's people had a duty to cast out the instruments of darkness from their midst. It was the final, crushing blow. The argument that had been building for weeks was suddenly, permanently over. He had given them permission to hate and a holy reason to do it. Finally, Justice Thompson turned to her. "Mary Payton," he said, his voice heavy, "do you have anything to say in response to these accusations?" The entire room held its breath. The silence was a physical thing, pressing in on her. She looked at the faces, the Millers, her neighbors, people she had known her entire life. She saw no room for reason, no crack in their certainty where the truth might take root. What could she say? To deny it was to lie, for how could she deny a thing that existed only in their minds? To explain the science of herbs and fevers would be to speak a foreign language. Her world of knowledge had no place here. So she said almost nothing. "I am a healer," she stated, her voice clear and steady, though it cost her everything she had. "I have harmed no one." Her simple, honest words were utterly useless against the storm of their hysteria. Her calm was seen as cunning, her lack of tears a sign of a hardened, unholy heart. Justice Thompson, bound by the law of the state, could find no credible evidence of a crime. He was forced to dismiss the formal charge, but his verdict was a hollow, meaningless sound. As the hearing concluded, a chilling silence fell. There were no shouts, no threats, just a quiet, absolute change. As Mary walked towards the door, the crowd did not touch her. They simply parted, creating a wide, empty path, as if she were a leper, a ghost, a thing so unclean they could not bear to be near her. The heavy cabin door swung shut behind her, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet. And in that moment, Mary Payton knew her life, as she had known it, was over. The walk from the meeting cabin back to her own was the longest journey of Mary Payton's life. The path was the same she had walked 1,000 times, but the world had been remade in the last hour. The sun was still warm on her face, the breeze still rustled the leaves, but the air itself felt different, thin and sharp in her lungs. She did not look at the other cabins she passed. She didn't have to. She could feel the flicker of a curtain in a window, the sudden stillness of a child's game in a yard, the weight of unseen eyes pressing on her back. She was no longer a neighbor. She was a haint, a living ghost walking through a town that had already buried her. When she reached her own door, her hand hesitated for a moment on the latch. This small cabin, once her sanctuary and her workshop, now felt like the only solid ground left in the world. She stepped inside, and the scent of drying herbs and wood smoke greeted her like an old friend. But there was no comfort in it now. It smelled of a life that was already over. With a final weary movement, she slid the heavy wooden bolt across the door. The sound, a solid, definitive thud, was the sound of a tomb being sealed. She was not locking the world out. She was locking herself in. There was no storm of weeping, no rage that shook the walls. What settled over Mary was a profound and chilling emptiness. She looked at her hands, the hands that had set bones and delivered babies and eased the final passage of the dying. They were the same hands, but their purpose had been stolen from them. Her knowledge, the intricate map of the natural world she carried in her mind, was now a useless treasure. The people she had served had chosen the comfort of a simple lie over the complexity of a difficult truth. It was a betrayal so deep it felt less like an injury and more like the slow onset of a mortal chill. As dusk bled into a moonless night, Mary sat in her single chair, unmoving, while the shadows in the cabin grew long and deep, consuming the jars of salves and the bundles of herbs until they were just shapes in the darkness. Every creak of the logs, every skittering sound on the roof was now a potential threat. The familiar night sounds of the mountains had become the footsteps of her neighbor's hatred. She hadn't fled. She hadn't been captured or struck down. Her final stand had been a simple refusal to run. And now, the sentence had begun. It was not death, but a living burial, a condemnation to absolute suffocating loneliness. The road had ended right here, at her own hearth. The tragedy did not end at Mary Payton's bolted door. It seeped out. A slow poison poured into the community's well. A week after the hearing, the Miller boy died. The fever finally consumed him in the dead of night. But his passing brought no release, no vindication for his parents. Their victory over the witch now tasted like ash in their mouths. They had done the unthinkable, cast out a neighbor, and for what? Their son was still gone. Their cabin became a place of profound, hollow grief, haunted not by a hex, but by the terrible question of whether they had destroyed an innocent woman for nothing. Thomas Miller, once a solid and respected man, became a ghost himself, his eyes vacant, his shoulders stooped under a weight far heavier than sorrow alone. The wreckage spread. As autumn deepened, bringing with it the croup and the lung fevers, the community felt Mary's absence like a missing limb. A farmer's wife, who had spoken at the hearing of souring butter, watched her own daughter struggle for breath with a cough that Mary could have soothed with a simple mullein tea. But who could she ask for help now? The other granny women in the surrounding hollows, hearing the story, grew cautious. Their knowledge, once a source of pride, was now a liability. They offered only the simplest remedies, their hands trembling, terrified that a failed cure would earn them the same brand that had been put on Mary. The social fabric, once woven tight by necessity and shared hardship, began to fray. The men and women who had stood to testify against Mary now looked at each other with a new, guarded suspicion. If a neighbor's bad luck could be blamed on a witch, whose bad luck would be next? And who would be blamed for it? Jedediah Stone, the old hunter, no longer shared his kills with the families who had spoken against Mary. A quiet, bitter line had been drawn through the heart of the settlement. The unity of the mob had shattered, leaving behind only the sharp-edged fragments of distrust and resentment. The community had sought to purge a single, perceived evil from its midst. Instead, they had invited a dozen real ones to take its place. They had sacrificed their healer on the altar of their fear. They had traded a woman's life for the illusion of control, only to find themselves more vulnerable than ever. The tragedy was not just Mary Payton's. It was the deep, self-inflicted wound of a people who, in trying to cast out a shadow, had managed only to extinguish a light. The true hex was not one Mary had cast, but one they had cast upon themselves, and its curse was one of silence, guilt, and a fear that had now truly taken root. In a dusty ledger, under the heading of the year 1802, a brief entry was made by Justice of the Peace Thompson. It likely read something to the effect of accusation of maleficium against Mary Payton, dismissed for want of evidence. With a dip of his quill and a scratch of ink, the official, written law of the state of Tennessee had spoken. On paper, Mary Payton was an innocent woman. But that piece of paper was 1,000 miles from the truth that now governed her life. This was the heart of the conflict, the true trial. It was the modern world, with its rules of evidence and its presumption of innocence, clashing directly with the ancient, unwritten code of the mountains. The state's law demanded proof, a witness who saw her cast a spell, tangible evidence of a poison. The mountain code required only a sick child, a curdled pail of milk, and a collective, unshakable fear. The law saw a citizen with rights. The community saw a supernatural threat that had to be contained by any means necessary. The community's reaction to the dismissal was not relief or sober reflection. They saw the verdict as a profound failure of the so-called civilized world to protect them. To them, Justice Thompson wasn't a man of reason. He was a fool, blinded by newfangled laws that didn't understand the real dangers lurking in the shadows of the world. The dismissal didn't exonerate Mary in their eyes. It proved that the devil was a cunning lawyer, able to use the very laws of man to shield his servants from righteous punishment. The circuit preacher seized on this narrative. From his pulpit, he likely spoke of the weakness of earthly courts when faced with a spiritual war. The verdict, he would have argued, was not a reason to welcome Mary back, but a command for the faithful to take up the burden that the law had dropped. They were now God's own jury, and their sentence of shunning was not an act of cruelty, but a holy quarantine, a sacred duty to wall off the source of infection from the rest of the flock. And so, was justice served? By the cold letter of the law, yes. Mary Payton was not fined, imprisoned, or executed. But in the court of survival and belief, the court that truly mattered in that isolated hollow, she had been found guilty and sentenced to a punishment that the law had no name for. The system had protected her body from the mob, but it was powerless to protect her spirit from their certainty. The verdict, meant to be the final word, was just a whisper lost in the roar of their fear, a perfect, tragic illustration of how true justice can be strangled by the hands of those who believe they are serving it. And what of the men who lit the fuse? What justice did the turning of the years bring to them? The answer, like the rest of this story, is not a simple one. The circuit preacher, the man who gave the community's fear its voice and its holy justification, met no grand downfall. He was a force of nature, a wildfire that sweeps through a dry valley. His work in that hollow was done. By the next spring, he was gone, having moved on to other settlements, other souls to save, carrying his brand of righteous fire with him. He likely never gave Mary Payton another thought. He left behind a community fractured by his sermon and faced no consequence for it at all. The fate of Thomas Miller was a quieter, more personal form of justice. He had won his battle. The witch had been cast out. But the victory was a hollow, desolate thing. It did not bring his son back. It did not bring him peace. Instead, he became a man haunted not by a curse, but by his own conviction. He had poured all of his grief and rage into the vessel of one woman, and when it was over, he had nothing left. He grew gaunt and silent, a man hollowed out by his own victory. Some neighbors whispered that the real curse was the one he had invited into his own soul, a poison of guilt and doubt that he would carry to his grave. There was no clean resolution, no satisfying final act where the villains received their just deserts. One antagonist simply vanished, an agent of chaos who moved on to his next stage. The other became his own jailer, trapped in a prison of sorrow and regret. It shows a difficult truth. In a tragedy fueled by fear, there are no real winners. The line between accuser and victim blurs until all that is left is the wreckage. The story was never about a single witch. It was about a sickness of the spirit, and it claimed everyone it touched. The winter that followed the hearing was a harsh one, and Mary Payton's cabin remained a dark, silent island in a sea of snow. No smoke rose from her chimney. No tracks marked the path to her door. When spring finally came and the world thawed, a quiet and terrible curiosity began to grow. It was Jedediah Stone, the old hunter, who finally put his shoulder to her door. The bolt, weakened by damp, gave way with a splintering crack. The silence inside was absolute. Mary was found in her chair, a figure of bone-thin stillness, having quietly wasted away in her self-imposed tomb. She had not starved for lack of food, but for lack of a world to live in. Her legacy had no bloodline to carry it. It was tied instead to the land she had occupied. No one dared to claim her cabin. It was left to the elements, a monument to the community's great and terrible secret. For years it stood as a warning, its roof slowly sagging, its walls surrendering to the relentless embrace of ivy and honeysuckle. Her garden, a living library of cures, went wild, a chaotic riot of potent herbs that no one else had the knowledge to use. The place became well and truly haunted, a spot children dared each other to run past at dusk, a physical reminder of the price of fear. The community did not heal, it scarred over. The name Mary Payton was almost never spoken aloud again. It became a taboo, a heavy stone of shared guilt and shame dropped into the well of their collective memory. The Miller family, broken by the tragedy, eventually packed their wagon and moved west, seeking a place where they were not known as the people who had cried witch. The silence they left behind was filled not with peace, but with a brittle and anxious piety. When sickness came now, people prayed harder, their faces turned to the heavens because they had cast out their most knowledgeable connection to the earth. The power dynamic in the hollow had shifted permanently. The preacher had moved on, but his legacy of fear remained. The delicate balance between folk wisdom and frontier faith had been shattered. In casting out their healer, they had elevated their fear. They had traded a woman of knowledge for a ghost story. The community was left poorer, more isolated, and more vulnerable, not to the dark arts, but to the simple, brutal realities of a world that Mary Payton had, in her own quiet way, understood better than any of them. Even today, if you know which overgrown path to take, you can find the place where Mary Payton's cabin once stood. There is nothing left now but a stone chimney fall, a silent monument half swallowed by the woods. Around it, you can still find plants that have no business growing together, a tangled ghost of her garden, with foxglove and ginseng still pushing up through the weeds. The land itself seems to hold a memory, a quiet that feels older and heavier than the surrounding forest. The real Mary Payton, the healer with the steady hands and the unbending will, was buried twice. Once in the cold earth, likely in an unmarked grave, and again under the weight of a legend she would never have recognized. Over the generations, her story was sanded down, its complex truths worn away until all that remained was a simple, sharp-edged tool used to frighten children. Old Witch Payton, they called her. She became the monster who lived in the ruins, the creature who would snatch you if you stayed out after dark. Her tragedy was repurposed into a local ghost story. Her name became a permanent scar on the landscape. The little valley where she lived is still known by some old-timers as Payton's Hollow. They might not know the full story of the Hearing or the Miller Boy, but they know it's a place to be wary of, a place with a history. The name itself is an echo, a fragment of a warning passed down through time. To speak the name of the hollow is to unknowingly repeat the final word of her community's judgment. And so, Mary Payton is gone, but her spirit, the idea of her, still haunts those mountains. She is the ghost of the woman who knew too much, the cautionary tale of what happens when you refuse to bend to the fears of your neighbors. She exists now as a whisper on the wind, a chill that runs down your spine when you pass a place where the woods feel a little too dark. She is a permanent resident of the Appalachian psyche, a timeless reminder of the ancient war between suspicion and knowledge, and of the terrible power of a story to kill a person long after they are dead. So we return to the question that hangs like mist in that forgotten hollow. Was Mary Payton a witch? The answer, of course, is no. She was a woman of knowledge in a time of fear, a healer whose competence was mistaken for dark power. Her story is not about what she was, but about what her community needed her to be. In the face of random, cruel misfortune, they desperately needed a source, a reason, a face to put on their terror. They needed a witch far more than they needed a healer, and so they transformed one into the other. In the end, this is a story about the true nature of evil. The monster in this ballad was not a woman who dealt in hexes and curses. The monster was a quiet, creeping thing called fear. It was fear that soured the milk, fear that wasted the child, and fear that turned good, God-fearing people into a mob that would condemn a woman to a living death. It's a timeless lesson about how a community, in its desperate search for a demon to fight, can become the very thing it dreads. It shows us how a person's greatest strength, in Mary's case, her unbending integrity, can become the fatal flaw that leads them to ruin. The law gave her a piece of paper that said she was innocent, but her neighbors gave her a sentence of silence that proved to be fatal. Her body lies in an unmarked grave, but her story has become a landmark, a warning that echoes down through the generations. And that, my friends, is the ballad of Mary Payton, a woman who knew all the secrets of the earth, but who could not find a cure for the sickness in the hearts of men.